Welcome back. I'm so glad you could join us today. It's our community, you know. Today we have a most interesting guest that many of you probably know as he wears one of his hats, but in his other hat, you may not know him. His name is Ryan Lefebvre. And Ryan is the voice of the Royals and a former baseball player and now an author. And he wrote a book called The Shame of Me, One Man's Journey into Depression and Back. I want to talk about the title. Why did you call it The Shame of Me?
Well, truth be told, Mary, I did not come up with the title. It was somebody who has a lot more
experience. But you had to say
yes. Yeah, I did. There's a chapter in the book called The Shame of Man, where I really get into why men are less inclined to talk about depression compared to women. And that's where they picked up on that it was not just the shame of man, but me being a man and me telling my story, that The Shame of Me was the title that they came up with. And it's gotten a very good response because unfortunately in our culture today, there's a stigma attached to a man who is
not
depressed.
being able to man up, as they say.
Exactly.
And isn't that a shame? It truly is, because illness doesn't know gender.
Mm-hmm.
Let me read to you. This is inside the front cover, which I thought was so powerful. He says, "I am alone, trembling on the floor of my closet. It's dark. There is no sound. I picture the cars driving away. They're leaving. They're leaving that image. I begin to sob, breaking into silence. They are leaving, and I am alone." That's tough, Ryan.
Yeah.
But that's the way he felt.
Yeah. And that's just, that was the tipping point for me. That was August of 2005, when any kind of defense that I had built up to fight against depression and anxiety, the walls just crumbled, and I just couldn't control myself, and I realized there was something wrong with me. But I felt alone when I was around people. I'm in a job where I'm around a team, the support staff, the broadcast team, let alone the 20 to 50,000 people who happen to be at the game. And
when
yet
you say I
alone.
felt alone, did you feel that they didn't understand you, that you were hurting and they didn't know it? Is that what made you feel alone?
Yeah, it wasn't a physically feeling alone. It was an emotionally feeling alone. Yeah, and it was, and to take it even a step further from what you suggest, it was more of just they wouldn't care to know what I'm feeling, and that gets back to the title of the book. This is because of my shame of going through this depression. That well, first of all, where I was in my life at that time. I'm in my mid-30s. I achieved most.
You had everything.
I had everything.
Right?
I'm most guy who watches football on Sunday and all the light beer commercials and how our country says this is what a guy should want in his life. I had all this stuff, and so I also felt like there would be no sympathy if I were to tell somebody I'm depressed.
Well, you
because,
were afraid they'd say to you, "What's wrong with you?
Yeah.
You got everything."
I was saying that to myself, what's wrong with you?
Yeah, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
But that made you feel even more alone.
Right.
We have to give credit to somebody before we start on your story.
Yeah.
And you have dedicated this book to your mother.
Mm-hmm.
And you say, after surviving a bloody war with depression herself, she returned to the battlefield to rescue me.
Yeah.
This story would have a different ending without her. This is Ryan's mother that he's talking about.
Yeah.
And that's what mothers do, Ryan.
Yeah.
We take care of our children no matter how old or how hard they're fighting. We try to be there and take care of them.
She was the first person I called on August 7, 2005. When I realized that I was not going to feel any better because of my accumulations and my achievements in my career and my personal life, that maybe I should just go back to the basics and call Mom, and maybe Mom could bail me out of this thing. She'd been through depression a couple of times, and I was aware of that, and I thought maybe she could offer me some insight, and
indeed
she gave me a lot more than that.
Indeed she did. But I wanted to give a little credit to Mom before we start on this.
Sure.
And when you were sitting on the floor of your closet, you were thinking, what happened?
Mm-hmm.
How did I get here? Did you come up with any answers? What went through your mind?
No, that was it. It was just such a confusing thing for me. I'd laid out all these
I remember he was
goals.
34 years old.
34 years old. I became a major league broadcaster when I was 24 years old, youngest in the major leagues at the time. I drove nice cars, I lived in a nice house, I made a nice income. All the things that I had set out to achieve, I mean, I pretty much achieved before I turned 30. And so, and I thought that was the pathway to happiness. So if I'm sitting in my closet of my bedroom, sobbing, confused, lonely, afraid, and my mindset to that point has been, if I achieve all the things I set out to do, then I'll be happy. Well, if I have all these things and I'm still not happy, what in the world is going to heal me from all this? I had no answer.
Well, and in great measure, your mother was like that too. Your
Yeah.
mother had a college education. She had been a model. She knew more than one language. I mean, to look at her, you think, what?
Yeah.
She had everything too.
Yeah.
But it doesn't help. Doesn't make any difference.
No, and I remember when my mom went through depression the first time. It was right after she gave birth to my younger brother, who's 13 years younger than I am. And so this was a year or so after he was born. I'm in high school, and I'm taking inventory of our life at that time, and I'm thinking, why can't she just snap out of this? And as people who have suffered through this, and as I talk about in the book, it would be nice if you could snap out of something like this. As I learned, there's a big difference between feeling depressed, because we all go through times in our life where we are going to feel depressed, because there is a parallel between life circumstances and how we feel. But when you are depressed, as opposed to feeling depressed, when you are going through depression, there is, in what they call in the psychological world, an incongruence between life circumstance and how you feel. I was feeling as though my life was falling apart and there was no hope, and yet there was nothing in my life. There was no circumstance that made me feel that way.
Well, and if somebody pointed that out to you, you certainly understand that that's true, but it doesn't make any difference.
And it makes it worse. That's what people, I think, I didn't understand, and other people don't understand. Another catchy way of describing depression is anger turned inward. So in many ways, when I would take my personal inventory, or somebody would say, hey, I mean, look at all these things that you have in your life. You have so much to look forward to. You have so many reasons to be happy. In some ways, it makes it worse, because it's just another way for me to be angry at myself and say, because I knew all these things. When people would say...
Did you feel that you didn't deserve all the things that you had?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think at some point I went through every range of emotion. I mean, if I can't be happy with all of this, and to be honest with you, I feel like I had a pretty good grasp of how blessed I was when it came to just about everything.
Yeah, no, I'm
and
sure.
how there are people who are much less fortunate in the world and in our country, in our city, than I was. I mean, I had a pretty good grasp of that, and that just made it worse, because I mean, there are people who would love to be in my position and would have so much joy with it. So it's a snowball effect. I mean, the things that you break up with a girl breaks up with you in middle school, you can take your son or daughter out for ice cream, and that's the end of that.
That makes it better.
Yeah, but I mean, because there's a parallel there to life circumstance.
That's
but
right. That's
but
right.
when you're in the confusion of depression, as I describe in the book,
I think that's a word we ought to pull out. Confusion.
Yeah, the confusion of depression. As I say in the book, it feels as though the world is having this great big party, and you're not invited.
And I guess the bottom line, Ryan, is that people are not always what they seem.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And we are not certain, when we look at people who pass through our lives for one reason or another, often we don't understand how big the bags of rocks are that they are dragging around. And I think that, and people don't always care.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
or they don't, they don't know how to care. I mean, it's, so many good things have come out of this experience for me. I wouldn't want to go through it again.
Oh, I was going to say, once is enough, I would think.
I mean, I call it, the worst thing that's ever happened to me, but also the best thing that's ever happened to me. And so because of what I went through, and I realized that there were a lot of people who did care about me, but they didn't know how to talk about this. Maybe they would then have to open up a can of worms that they don't want to open. So it's helped me to be able to recognize in other people where I'm not afraid to say, are you okay? I talk about Fred White in the book, the Royals announcer I replaced several years ago. And because of a twist of fate, we ended up doing Royals games together. And we're on the train going to Yankee Stadium in New York, and I had a horrible night the night before. And Fred says to me, you know, are you okay? And like every other guy, you know, I'm fine, you know, but he just pressed on. No, are you okay? Are you really okay? Well, you know, after a while I couldn't hold back. And so, and this is not a slight against anybody else who was around me in that time and cared about me, but it's hard stuff to dive into someone else's darkness because you don't know what kind of darkness you're going to find in your own life.
You don't know what's going to pop out at you. That's right. And you know, you talk about in your book about feeling really terrible, and then you begin to get some help because you met Dale, and the idea was, and this to me was so interesting, to separate the facts, and you used the word lies, to separate the facts from the lies. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, the mind is a very powerful thing, and you know, we know about the power of positive thinking, and you know, we're taught to, you know, think positive, to have hope, and you know, people who think big, you know, receive big, on and on. We don't spend as much time on the opposite side of that, you know, the power of negative thinking, and to a point where we begin to create things in our minds that don't exist. And so when I'm with Dale Williamson, my counselor, and I'm talking to her, and she says, you know, how do you feel? You know, why do you believe you are so depressed? And I start, you know, laying these things out in front of her, these perceptions of what's going on in my life. And then she would say to me, is that true?
When you started laying those things out, did you blame others? What kind of things did you lay out? In other words, were they things that I shouldn't have done this, or it happened because so-and-so didn't do what they should have done?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think at that point, I was mostly blaming myself. Excuse me. And but I would say things like, you know, I'm not a very lovable person. You know, nobody is going to want to listen to me. Nobody's going to understand. And she would say, okay, nobody, I mean, let's think about what you're saying here. Nobody is going to understand, you know, so it sounds simple, but I began to program myself into using these absolutes, never, nobody, on and on. And
all
so,
negatives.
All negatives, and not truths. They weren't truths. And so the power of the mind for me began to convince me of things that weren't even true, to a point where I believed that I had my future all figured out, and it was going to be a lonely future with, you know, surrounded by people who didn't care about me, and it was something that I created on my own because I fell into this trap of houses and cars and careers and finances and all that.
Well, the other interesting part is that you had some terrible downs, some ups and terrible downs, but all this while you were still functional.
Yeah.
You worked the whole time.
Yeah.
Talk about that a little bit. How did you do that?
I have no idea. You know, the thing about this book is, as I began to feel better, and as I'm sharing these insights through counseling and prayer and conversation with friends and reading books, I would share them with my mom, and she said, write it down. And I thought, I'm not much of a writer. Of course, I'm an author of a book now, but I'm not, by nature, I'm not a writer. And her thinking was that as you begin to get better, you need to write these things down. Similar to talking to Dale, you know, when you figure out a truth about yourself and your situation, write it down so that if I ever began to experience a backslide, I could go back to my own words, not a journal written by a professional counselor whom I've never met before, but my own words. So writing all these things down, these experiences, ended up being good therapy. So I bring that up, getting back to your question, because if I hadn't written these things down when I did, and then 3 years later, Jeffrey Flanagan and Ascend Books come to me and say, would you write a book? There are so many things that I would have forgotten because it just kind of flushed out of my memory. But because I wrote them down, I read the book months after it came out just to kind of go through it again. And I remember, I forgot about that. I forgot about that. But yeah, the work thing was a curse and a blessing at the same time, because there were so many days on the road, especially with the Royals, that I thought, I can't do it today. I mean, Cleveland in particular was one that stands out when I realized I can't do this anymore. I can't go to work.
Did you start to self-medicate with alcohol?
I did not. I had quit drinking, which could be another book, back in 1998. But that was my medication for
Yes, it
years.
was.
I didn't realize
Yes, it
I
was.
thought it was just social, recreational drinking with friends.
Just
and
one heck of a guy.
Yeah, I'm in my
That's
you know
right.
early
That's
mid-20s.
right.
This is
That's
what
right.
guys do, you know. And but that was my medication.
Yeah.
So on one hand, I'm getting pats on the back for quitting my alcohol use, but at the same time, now I had no medication, and that's when the depression began to build. But I was in Cleveland one day, and I decided I'm going to wait till everybody goes to the ballpark, and when they leave, I'm going to check myself into the nearest hospital in Cleveland. And I was going to go into the emergency room, and I was going to say, you need to check me in and medicate me with some fancy-dancy drug, mind-calming drug, whatever that is, medication. And I pictured in my mind saying, what's wrong with you? And I was going to say, I don't know, but you either check me in or you're going to be cleaning me up off the street. And
But you had gotten to the point where you couldn't cope anymore. See, you got to get down to a point where you can't cope before you seek to go up.
Right. And then fast forward to another time in New York, the night before the encounter with Fred White on the train. That's when the anxiety and the depression, the rapid heartbeat and the sweating and the inability to sleep, when I began to realize, you know, maybe there's something physically going on with me here. Maybe it's not just mentally and emotionally. And shortly after that, I went to a doctor, and then that's when I started on the medication.
Well, you talk about also that you weren't happy. What is happy? What did you define? What was you thinking? What is happy? I'm not sure what happy is.
Yeah, I think happy for me was, you know, if I achieved a certain income, if I drove a certain car, if I lived in a certain house, and I had a certain job, I should be happy 99% of the time. And you know, I drank the wrong Kool-Aid.
It wasn't a magic pill, right?
It was not a magic pill at all.
No, it
And so, getting back to what we were talking about earlier, the more I focused on how happy I should be, you know, the more ashamed I was for how I actually did feel at that time.
I think, but you see, there's some words that keep coming out. One is happy, one is alone, one is ashamed,
Yeah.
one is unworthy. All these things are, I mean, I'm picking up the threads of what you're talking about here, and that's how you felt.
Yeah, yeah, constantly. I mean, it was. I mean, I don't know how I got through that summer, because this started in August, so I had all of August and all of September. Every day was a battle just to get to the game. I remember. I mean, at that point, I'd been doing what I was doing for several years, and I remember going through disappointments. But I could compartmentalize it. I could kind of put it off to the side. I could broadcast the game, and then I could go home and deal with my issues. This one was different because I couldn't. I mean, I remember, and someday I'm going to listen to the tapes of some of these games, because I remember some of these days specifically where I would be constantly thinking about how awful my life was and how badly I felt. And I was calling the game at the same time. And I would become emotional during games, and thankfully at that time I was doing mostly radio and only some television. And as
They couldn't see your face, right?
Couldn't see my face,
Yeah.
and I alternated innings with Denny Matthews. So during his innings, I would say I'm going to go to the bathroom, and I'd, you know, wherever we were, I'd go into the restroom, close the stall, and I would cry for 5 minutes and compose myself and come back. So I mean, I honestly don't know how I got
that
through
took
it.
a lot of grit,
Yeah.
Ryan. I must say
Yeah.
it did. You know, the other thing that I plucked out of this book was that in your despair, you were always trying to plan far into the future. What was going to happen? What, in other words, the present was not. You were worrying about the future all the time.
Yeah.
What? Why? What was that all about? Talk about that just a little bit.
Well, I get back to the power of negative thinking, and that, you know, if I'm not happy right now, how is this ever going to get better? And if it's not going to get better, then it's only going to get worse. And so I began to just.
But it was sort of an obsession, and then that would trigger that panic and anxiety.
Yeah.
I mean, who knows? I mean, I don't know what I'm going to be doing tomorrow.
Well, in the middle of major depressive disorder, you know, there is no light at the end of the tunnel at all. I mean, so there's no feeling of, you know, my situation is going to improve. And so there's the tendency to look forward into the future, and it's just dark. It's just bleak. I mean,
were you on medication at that time?
I began medication in early September, so about a month after, you know, the big breakdown in August. And you know, the medication was very helpful for me. It took 5 to 6 weeks for it to really kick in. And thankfully, another blessing I had, you know, my best friend, Eric von Slegel, was and is in the pharmaceutical business. And so he was able to kind of guide me through what antidepressants are, and maybe more importantly, what they are not. I think there are a lot of people who feel like antidepressants are like a vaccine for depression, you know. And as he explained to me, this is not a cure-all here. This is a get you so you can
get you together.
Get you together. You can think rationally. So when you go into counseling, these things will begin to make more sense to you. And he told me then, and I'm glad he did, is that, you know, the goal, if antidepressants are handled correctly, is to get off them eventually. It's not.
Are you still on them?
No. I've been off them for, oh gosh, coming up on 3 years. But I was on them for 3.5 years, and I would, and if I felt like I needed them, I would gladly go back on them again, because it really did help me. But there's more than just the medication. The medication served its purpose for me, but the reason I had the breakthroughs that I did is because I continued my counseling. I had a life coach helping me kind of move forward in my life, and I call it my triangle of recovery. It was counseling, medication, and life coach. Counseling, kind of going back and dealing with what happened to me in my past that led me to where I am today, the belief systems I had, you know, disappointments, whatever. The medication to calm me down, and then the life coaching, or whatever you want to call it, for the plan moving forward, and having people in my life that are going to be accountable, help me stay accountable. I learned that, you know, too many people take the medication and they feel good right away, but that's all they do. So they don't deal with what triggers them to feel the way that they feel. And medication works for a while, then they try another medication, and that one didn't work, and another medication. And on the flip side, you have people that are going to counseling once or twice a week all the time, but they don't have the medication to supplement. So the counseling feels good for a while, but as soon as they get in their car and they drive home, you know, those voices come back.
It's all back again. Well, and there's a difference between being depressed and feeling depressed.
Right.
And I'm sure everybody feels depressed once in a while, and that's somewhat normal. But it leads me into therapy. What is the purpose? What did the therapy do for you? It helped you to separate the truth from the untruth?
And more than that, what came out of therapy for me was, and this is kind of the confusing part of my journey, is that my mom and I had what I thought was a close relationship, and it became much closer as she, you know, nursed me through, mothered me through, you know, this event in my life. But simultaneously, I was dealing with this emotional detachment from my mother. It's very confusing for me, because here's this woman who's there for me whenever I need her as I'm going through this, yet my biggest issue was this emotional detachment. Through therapy, I was able to go back to probably about the age of 4 or 5, and some life circumstances where I began to feel detached from my mother. She was in her early 30s.
She was having troubles of her own.
Divorced from my father, kind of going through some things that I went through. And so what the counseling was able to do is take me back and go and explain to me why I feel the way I feel today about myself, about life, about love, about career. Where did I come up with this belief system? What are the truths and the lies of this belief system? It's hard work.
It is, but she said something very interesting to you. And she said, what do you want on the inside?
Yeah.
She said to you. And she said, what I'm hearing are things that you want on the outside. Yeah. So it occurs to me that jogs you. You have to move inside.
Yeah.
That was a very telling and a very, I would think, a very changing statement that she made.
Well, you ask somebody, what do you want? And they'll say, well, I want $1 million. So they think they want $1 million. Okay, well, why do you want $1 million? Well, because, I could pay off bills. Well, why do you want to pay off all your bills and your debts? Well, I mean, it would make me, feel less pressure. Well, why do you want to feel less pressure? Well, then it would give me some peace. Well, why is peace so important to me? Well, it would make me feel secure. It would make me feel at rest. So they think they want $1 million, but if you peel back all those layers of what you want on the outside, what you really find out is that the $1 million is not what they want.
No.
They want the peace, they want the security, and so that's the whole purpose of, I could, on the outside, life was great for me, but on the inside, what I had on the outside and what I truly wanted on the inside were two completely different things.
Well, and you also noted that your recovery was greatly assisted when you turned your anger from the inside to the outside.
Yeah.
Who were you angry with on the outside?
Oh gosh, it was whoever I was angry with at that particular moment,
and the list changed rapidly.
The list changed, but when I began to give it a voice, and I took these feelings that I had and I just verbalized them, and I, literally a purging of toxins that were inside of me, that you begin to get some momentum after that. After a while, that I don't have to hide with these feelings and these fears. That the more I shared them, the more I realized that they weren't real. They were just these made up worst case scenarios that I had in my head. And that when I began, and when I allowed myself to be angry, I had an incident with a friend that I write about in the book, that I vented on her because I was angry at somebody else, that it just felt good to just come back to life, and that the anger at that particular time was a good thing. And then I realized, I don't have to keep all of this inside here. I can share this with somebody, and I felt good.
Everything isn't equally important.
Right.
So I think that's part of a problem too that many people have, and they just get overwhelmed because they're not able to prioritize so what? It's hard to say so what.
Right.
But you're a Focus graduate.
Yeah.
What did Focus do for you?
Well, it put me in a room with 40 other people, and made me realize that I wasn't the only one going through these things. Now, it may have manifest itself differently in me than it would from somebody else. Women report depression at a much higher rate than men do. And it's not because women are more depressed than men are, and
they're willing to report it?
They're willing to talk about it.
Yeah.
Men, we turn to alcoholism, we turn to drug abuse, we turn to pornography, we turn to work, we turn to exercise, all of these other things that we go to because we don't want to deal with it. Where a woman goes to a doctor's office and the doctor says, well, how you been feeling? Well, she's going to tell him how she feels.
That's
where a
right.
guy says, well, I'm fine. I'm fine. So Focus seminars just put me in a room with people that weren't going through what I was going through, but I realized this is going on all around me.
I'm not the only person.
Yeah.
Are you cured?
No. Don't think I ever will be. I manage it. I've and my apologies to any diabetics who might be watching, and my comparison isn't dead on, but I liken it to diabetes. It's somebody who is able to take control of their diabetes. They know when to take their insulin shots. They know how to manage their diet. They know what they can do, what they can't do. And when they have some sort of an episode, there is a remedy for it. But depression...
Does stress trigger it?
Sure, stress, lack of sleep, all those things. But somebody who has diabetes can't will themselves to be cured from diabetes. They have to do medically and through diet what they need to do, and the same is with depression.
Well, I would say thank you, Ryan Lefebvre, for coming, and I would suggest to you that there are many out there who could profit by reading Ryan's story, and I think the bottom line is that none of us is alone.
Yeah.
And I thank you for being with us. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you for being with us, and it's always a pleasure to invite you in to learn some more about our community. Thank you so much. See you soon.